Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Dr. Gupta and Meena, for giving me the chance. I know that I'm the last speaker, that I am between you and the dinner. If I don't do a good job properly, I could end up being your dinner on the table. Ambassador mentioned about my Israeli connections. I spent about 10 years in Israel. I also have a Chinese connection. My wife is a Chinese national. That's a deadly combination in India. Because if you look at the Indian left, they talk about the Israeli connection. The Indian right talks about the Chinese connection. I'm stuck between the two. And with the result, the establishment keeps a distance, I keep a safe distance from the establishment. So what I'm going to say today is my understanding of it. I may be right, I may be wrong, but I'll not give you a spin. But if you look at India's response in the last 2 years, we never made any official statement on the Arab Spring against any country for that matter. So I need to reconstruct from whatever little was said or unsaid. But having said that, I can say with a degree of humility that India was less hypocritical than most of the countries in the world. If you look at some countries, they support a regime in one case, they support the protesters in another case, or vice versa. At least in the Indian case, we did not indulge in that. And the title says, Self-Appointed Frontrunner for the UN Security Council. That is a colorful expression used by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in one of the internal memos which was subsequently leaked to the WikiLeaks. That actually sums up the Indian situation. We are probably the only country, we thought great power is something like India International Center. You apply filling up a form and a proposer and a seconder and some amount of money, you become a member of the high table. That shows our historical understanding of how a great power is made. Having said that, quite a lot of people were arguing that India should be very forceful, it should take a leadership role in the Arab Spring. But if you look at what India has done in the last 2 years, it's one of the most sensible things we ever probably did since 1947. We stopped giving sermons for a change. And I think that is what I'm going to explain and why and how that position came about. If one looks at India's interests, is indifference an option for India? What is happening in Arab Spring is, I'm not an Arab, I have nothing to do with that. Can India remain indifferent towards that? You may be even tempted to suggest such an option. If you honestly look at India, number of people who actually made Middle East, as I prefer to call the region, a lifetime job is probably 2 dozens, not more than that. In a country of 1 billion people, you will not find a large number of people. For them, Middle East is their bread and butter. Not many people. If you look at Indian official establishment, it's very nice to say Middle East is important in everything. After the Arab Spring, there was no visit by the president, vice president, or prime minister from this country. The closest thing we got was a visit to Iran within the context of NAM. But otherwise, there was no state visit. The last visit was visit by our president in November 2010 to UAE and Syria. That was before the Arab Spring. And if you look at Indian newspapers rather carefully, in January this year, we were supposed to have the Sultan of Oman as the chief guest. And it did not happen. And the government of India did not even explain. If you ask them privately, they'll say, we never issued official invitation, we never got there. Find out the reason. There was a mess there. If you're going by this reality, you will say that Arab Spring is indifferent. It's not relevant for us. India could adopt an indifferent position. As some of the speakers will tell you tomorrow about India and the Gulf, India does not have the luxury of being indifferent towards the Arab Spring. We have a substantial interest in the region. It may be politically incorrect to say that. But I can say that the Middle East is far more important than India's immediate neighborhood. South Asia for me is a strategic liability. If I don't handle the region carefully, their problem will become my problem. So in that context, I had to pay attention to all the neighbors of India. But if you look at the Middle East, it gives you enormous opportunity which India should capitalize on that. We have a strong political relationship, historically speaking. We have a strong economic relationship. Our largest export destination today is UAE, which is the second largest trading partner of India. If you look at the top 20 trading partners, 6 of them are from the Middle East. And we have religious relations. We are the third largest Islamic population in the world, second largest Shia population in the world. We have enormous energy relations. Almost 60% of energy needs are met by imports from the Persian Gulf. I call Persian Gulf not the Gulf, which is commonly referred to. As the minister mentioned in the morning, we have about 6.5 million Indian expatriate labor who contribute substantially to the 70 billion we received last year. If you put all the numbers together, indifference is not an option. Okay, can we empathize with the protesters? Because the protest was almost symbolizing what India always stood for. At least if you look at the initial stages, they were largely peaceful. Peaceful in the Middle Eastern sense of the word, not in the Gandhian sense. Because Gandhi talked about Jewish non-violence against Hitler. I'm not talking in that sense of the word. I'm talking about the Middle East sense of the word, when most rulers either die in office or removed through a bullet. Otherwise, you never see a change of power. Probably Arafat was the first leader to be elected by popular votes in the Middle Eastern countries. Otherwise, you know that he was the first one, 1996. So, in that context, the Arab Spring was peaceful, at least in the initial stages. Eventually, the regimes were not willing to accommodate them, then it turned violence. So, you can say that. What were their demands? They were simply demanding the basic things: good governance, accountability, a reform. If you look at a larger context, they were simply asking about an inclusive polity. And that is the tragedy of the Middle East. If you look at the post-Ottoman scenario, no country in the Middle East, including Israel, Turkey and Iran, evolved an inclusive national identity. None of them. They are all very selective in their defining the national identity. So Arab Spring, in a way, is simply asking them, can we have an inclusive polity? But in that case, can we empathize with the protesters? That's not an option. Because democratic promotion is never Indian foreign policy agenda. We never tried that, even though the concept of democracy was very briefly touched upon when India was in power. That was never a foreign policy objective of India. That's also because democratic promotion has its own problems. Our own track record is not very impressive. People will tell you a decade later, in Kashmir, there was a single-digit voting. At that time, you ask, everything was more than 50% everything. You know, we take our own time to come to terms with truths and facts. So that said, democracy promotion is completely out of the question, because you'll get into a lot of problems. It comes with a human rights record, and Indian record is not very impressive either. So if you say that, so we do not have the luxury of empathizing with the protesters. Okay, can we support the status quo? Why get into all these things? And these people are not going anywhere. There is no definite leadership. So therefore, why can't we simply support the regime? That is also suicidal. Because if you look at it, with the sole exception of Qatar, every country witnessed widespread popular discontent in some form or the other. Qatar was probably an exception because it's the highest per capita country in the world. No other reasons. In that situation, when the rulers are unpopular in their own countries, India simply ill afford to befriend any of them. Okay, there were exceptions. If you go back and check all the Indian papers before 2010, you will find out what you would call the prince in India, Rahul Gandhi, met Gamal Mubarak. And Saif Gaddafi was in Delhi. So we were no better than other countries. Now today nobody is willing to talk about them. These are all official meetings. It is done by government and MEA, and everybody was party to these arrangements. So in that situation, can we continue the status quo? You can't. Because if the rulers are unpopular, there is simply no other option for India to side with them. In those circumstances, what do you do? We did something rather much more practical and mundane. First of all, we never issued any statements against any country. It always comes as part of the larger foreign policy statement. One line, one paragraph in a general statement. The second thing was, India's primary concern was the welfare of Indian nationals in this region. That was the prime concern. So you issued travel advisories. That came in Egypt, in Tunisia, and in the Syrian case, we waited almost a year. It came only January last year, not before that. Or when situation went little complicated, we decided to establish a special cell for Indians who want to leave that country. So we evacuated a substantial number of Indians working in Libya and in Egypt. India set up a hotline in Yemen. You know what happened? They shut it down after 3 days because nobody called. People are more happy in living in that war-torn country than come back and look at the starry lifestyle here. What do they do when they come back to India? So therefore, they are more happy living in Yemen than accepting Indian SOS and coming back to it. But then you simply cannot, and if you look at carefully, there was no travel advisory against Bahrain or in other places. The North Africa was a different story. But if you look at the Gulf countries, that is where bulk of India's 6.5 million Indians who expatriate laborers work. There is no official statement. There is not even a suggestion of an evacuation. Imagine if you have to evacuate people from Saudi Arabia. You need a Hanuman to build a bridge from Saudi Arabia and India. There is no way I'm going to think of even a 2 million people evacuations. So therefore, your interest lie in people living in those countries and exist, because that is where the entire social fabric was rested upon. So if you look carefully, there was no statement about travel advisory on any of the Gulf countries. But at the same time, we have to wait for the consensus. In all the countries, wherever India wanted to make a step forward, we waited for a national consensus to emerge. Somewhere in February 2011, our foreign minister, during an interaction with the media persons, says, President Mubarak should listen to the voice of the Egyptian people. By then it was very clear the Indians have been evacuated from Egypt, and the bulk of the Egyptian population is against Mubarak. It is very clear. Almost overwhelming majority of people were in Tahrir Square and want Mubarak go. In those circumstances, India made a very tacit statement. And if you go back and find it in MEA website, you will not find that statement. You have to find it in a newspaper because it's a press briefing informally done. You will not even find that statement in the MEA website. Because we were extremely careful in making any statement which will be construed as an interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign state. Why? Because if you do that, tomorrow morning somebody will say the same thing about Kashmir. So therefore, this is one way of protecting any possible repercussions on these issues. The second thing we did at the region was that we waited for a regional consensus. If you recognize the situation on the ground in certain countries were very fluid. For instance, in the case of Libya or in Syria. So we waited for some amount of regional consensus to emerge. Indian support in favor of a direct or indirect UN action was preceded by the Arab League and the African Union making a strong statement against no-fly zone. It was only then India decided to make a position on Libya. The same situation in Syria. India did not make any statements about Syria when everybody knew there was widespread violence within Syria. But only after general Arab League position in favor of a direct or indirect external intervention, India decided to support the UN Security Council resolution. But then when the issue was brought before the General Assembly, India said it is not balanced because you only talk about the military by the regime, not by the opposition forces. Therefore, when Saudi Arabia decided to move a resolution, India simply did not support that position. This is the context in which you have to look at India's aspiration for a great power. It is, if you look at mere statement, that's one thing. If Arab Spring is an indication, India's aspiration will be accompanied by very calculated, realistic positions, not by rhetoric, not by emotional argument, not by simply moral judgment. It will be simply governed by realism. and hardcore arguments. And in that sense, the government was more sensible than most of the intelligentsia in this country. They were simply arguing about either focusing on the American double standards. What are they saying in Libya and Syria, but not in Bahrain? That is how Indian intellectuals were arguing. The American double standards vis-a-vis Bahrain and Syria. But the government was probably more sensible than all of us put together. They are saying that if you are in trouble, go back to the ancient Indian saying. Sometimes silence is golden. Thank you very much.